We're rounding out our second unit, looking at ethical issues by considering ethical treatment of the environment. We started with animals. We went through a bunch of human concerns. Now we're looking at something you might say that is wider, larger than humanity, which is the ecosystem in which we live, in which all the plants and animals are a part. And so one question that we might ask in an ethics class is, how should we treat the environment? Well, it kind of depends on your frame of reference, right? Virtue theory, what does virtue theory have to say about the environment? Well, nothing so much really specific, right? Maybe we have some sort of interest in maintaining the environment insofar as we're trying to live the best lives that we can for ourselves, right? We don't want to destroy everything because that would prevent us from becoming virtuous. So maybe we should care about it a little bit on virtue theory grounds. Perhaps a better case can be made through utilitarianism, right? Insofar as, look, we depend on natural resources. We don't want to screw up our world because then we'll all die. We have a vested interest in maintaining the environment, looking out for it in certain ways. Deontology, it's a little less clear, right? Kant in his writings is concerned with describing morality and its connection to rationality. And he thinks that only rational beings are capable of being moral. Well, insofar as we are all human beings with our own wills and goals, we ought not to treat each other merely as objects, so we have obligations to other people. But do we have obligations to animals? Maybe we have an indirect obligation to the environment insofar as we depend on it. You could provide a case from divine command theory why we should care about the environment, right? If you read Genesis in a certain way, the idea is that, well, although this was basically made for us, we still ought to be good stewards of it, because that is what God calls us to do. So this is what we're basically going to be investigating today. How should we treat the environment? And we're going to be doing it by looking at one really influential work on environmental ethics by an American philosopher, Aldo Leopold. Leopold was an American philosopher, environmentalist, forester, ecologist, writer. He's somebody who's played a really influential role in the wildlife preservation movement in the U.S., as well as the larger environmentalism movement in Western society. What we're looking at today is just a small part of a book that he wrote in the mid-20th century, which is known as A Sand County Almanac. And it's in this book that Leopold basically provides his understanding of humans' relationship to the environment, and therefore the kinds of obligations that places on us. So this is generally what we're going to be investigating today. As we'll see, he takes a rather unsurprising environmentalist position. He basically thinks we're fucking it all up. We're not seeing everything in the appropriate way. Our relationship to the environment isn't properly understood, and therefore he's going to advocate for better environmental education and us changing not only our understanding of what it means to live in a natural environment, but also practically our relationship to it. Make sense? We're not going through anything super difficult today. But I think it's interesting, his overall conception. So I'd like to share that with you. He starts off the reading today by discussing what he thinks is a primary feature of all ethical systems. When we looked at utilitarianism, when we looked at deontology, when we looked at virtue theory, all of these views basically presumed that humans are operating in a field in which their actions have impacts on other things, and their actions have impacts on one another. When we read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation chapter, we saw that our actions have impacts on animals. Today we're going to be focused on how our actions impact the environment, but we need to internalize this general idea. All ethical systems are based on the idea that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. So we don't act or live in a vacuum. Our actions have wider impacts. They ripple out into society, into other people's lives, into the environment, etc. The ethics of care also focused on this, right? Insofar as we are in relationships with other people, we should consider how our actions impact them and whether or not we're showing up in our relationships. So, on this premise, Leopold is going to kind of build his environmental ethics. Thus, if we're trying to figure out how we ought to live, how to be good people, how to do moral, right, virtuous things, however you want to cash it out, we should be paying attention to the systems that we are a part of, how our actions are impacting those systems. If they're sustaining them, promoting them, harming them, all that kind of stuff. The political system, the economic system, the ecological system, all of this stuff. Okay. Now, I told you that he's going to take an environmentalist position, and that's what he does. He basically thinks that we have not been treating the environment properly. Pretty surprising coming from an environmentalist, right?
Very.
He's like, look at what we're doing to the environment. And this is something that he was talking about in like the 1940s, 1950s. He says we're polluting the environment, we're destroying habitats unnecessarily, we are harming the soil, which is basically hurting our ability to produce stuff in the future through our farming methods. We're clearing out forests for wood that we don't need. You might use the Amazon as a particular example, a lot of which is being cleared for cattle grazing land, which will then be used to feed humans. Do we need to eat all of that meat? Here's another thing that we could talk about, meat production and its impact on the environment. Basically, Leopold is going to say, we have not been respecting the land. We have not been respecting animal life, plant life. Our treatment of the environment has been based on our own economic interests, production and consumption. And insofar as that's how we're interacting with the environment, we're hurting it, and as we'll see, also be hurting ourselves retroactively. What Leopold is trying to do in this piece is get us to reconceptualize our relationship to the environment. See, he thinks that we've built society on this idea that humans are like the masters of nature and that we are supposed to be presiding over and controlling everything. And we've kind of built our society and our economic policy on the idea that, oh, you know, we're the biggest, baddest thing around. We don't really need to care about anything else. He thinks that this is not only immoral, but it's mistaken. One of the central ideas in this piece that he tries to make clear is this idea that none of the organisms, none of the plants, the ecosystems, humans, mammals, fish, whatever, none of these things are disconnected from anything else. things are in stronger or weaker relationship to one another, but we're all living on this earth together. And so things that affect one population are necessarily going to ripple out and affect other populations. Effects on one ecosystem are going to have effects on other ecosystems. So we need to be considering all of this stuff when we're trying to figure out, well, how do we move forward? What is it that we are actually doing with clearing out the Amazon rainforest, destroying it, making way for cattle grazing land, etc.? One of the central ideas that I want to focus on today is his concept of the biotic pyramid, which is kind of a biological view of humans' relationship to the environment. Humans, he says, are just one small part of this larger energy pyramid that is supposed to delineate how we are related to the other organisms and how the organisms are related to each other on Earth. As we'll see, he's going to argue that although we are basically at the top of the pyramid, we're like the apex predators on Earth due to our intelligence, our tool use, that doesn't make us any more disconnected from the soil, the plants, the insects, the rodents, and the other mammals. See, he's going to argue that insofar as we're all living on this earth together with finite resources and all these different organisms are interconnected, we need to pay special attention to how our actions impact any one of the layers of this biotic pyramid. So we can imagine the bottom layer as having to do with soil and mineral and water, decomposers, things that recycle the energy in our larger ecosystem. If we wanted to describe this in terms of energy, we could say, look, the soil basically provides a certain environment and nutrients for plants to grow. Plants are critical, right? Plants take nutrients and minerals from the soil and energy from the sun through photosynthesis, and they convert that energy into something that is then eaten by bugs and insects and larger organisms. Unsurprisingly, other organisms feed on those things, right? The insects and the bugs and the worms and the things like that. We can trace out the different relationships between the organisms on Earth by noting that each level depends critically on the levels beneath it for its own survival. If all of the plants died out, we would die out. It would have cascading effects up the pyramid, right? If suddenly all of the minerals and nutrients were stripped from our soil, none of the plants would be able to grow, so nothing that would feed on the plants would be able to survive. Then eventually we would die, right? This is how Leopold understands our relationship to the environment. We might be on the top of the pyramid as apex predators, but we depend critically for our own existence on the levels below us. Due to the way these different plants and organisms interact, energy gets transferred up the biotic pyramid and eventually gets recycled back to the base through waste and these organisms that decompose the stuff that we produce. Does this picture make sense? Do y'all understand what he's trying to get at here? Basically, this is like biology 101, right? How energy gets transferred in this environment in which we live. Thus, because this is how we are connected to the other organisms on Earth, this has certain implications for how we ought to treat those organisms and how we ought to treat the environment. Because, to put it bluntly, if we fuck up the environment, we're going to fuck up the organisms near the base layer, and that's going to affect everything above it. right? So if we pollute the soil and the water, plants are not going to be able to grow. Organisms are not going to be able to feed on the plants. Organisms are not going to be able to feed on those. There won't be any resources for us eventually. And so none of these layers are ultimately distinct from one another. They are all connected in these important, complex biochemical ways. All right? If something happens to the deer population in a certain habitat, something is also going to happen to the wolf population in that habitat, right? If all of the plankton were to die out in the oceans, that would kill off a lot of other marine life. And it might kill off a lot of humans insofar as planktons are incredibly important for the production of oxygen on Earth. Just go check out some of those Planet Earth documentaries. I'm surprised humans have not started worshiping plankton. But maybe it's because we discovered them pretty late in our social development. Perhaps, yeah. We can represent these relationships with food chains. You're probably familiar with these from high school, right? Which organisms feed on one another, how energy gets transferred through the actions of these organisms. Each species of organism is a link in many chains. And so it's not true that one organism dying off is going to be just like a small thing. Any change in the population of one organism is going to have cascading, rippling effects on a bunch of other organisms. It's not like it's just going to be localized just to that habitat or that geographical area. Okay? So this is the way biology works. If our production of food depends on the health of the soil and the health of the water, if our meat production depends on having healthy cows, healthy chickens, then we need to look at each of the layers in this pyramid to make sure that we're not going to be destroying things. This is the general idea. We are not disconnected from the soil and the water, the bugs, the plants. All of this stuff is critical to our survival and to our success, as well as the survival and the success of the other species on Earth. It exists in kind of a contentious equilibrium right now, but it is not outside the sphere of possibility for us to disrupt that in a way that we can't fix, right? Just like we have the ability to completely kill ourselves with nuclear weapons if we wanted to. So, what is Leopold trying to get us to do? Well, he's trying to get us to realize how strongly connected we are to the other organisms on Earth, how we depend on them in certain ways that are not obvious to us, right? Because, look, we don't understand how all of these different organisms are connected. We simply haven't done that research. It's too complex for us, perhaps, to have a complete understanding and knowledge of how, one species of insect, if that were to die out, the kind of larger effects that would have. So, what Leopold is trying to get us to do is reconceptualize our relationship to nature and to care not only about the other species of animal on Earth, but also the things on which the animals depend, the things that we depend on, things like the soil and the water, what he's going to call the land. So he's going to put forth what he calls a land ethic. Everything depends on the land. If the water goes, everything else goes. If we extract all of the nutrients and minerals out of the soil, that's going to kill the plant life, which is going to kill the animal life, which is going to kill our ability to produce food. The animals that we eat, it's going to kill humans. So, we need to pay attention to how we're treating the lakes and the rivers, the soil, the fields, the forests, all of these different things, okay? What he calls the land. More generally, he defines it kind of as the whole collection of the relationships in the biotic pyramid. Every element, the soil, water, plants, animals, all the way up to us. Because we're not ultimately distinct from the other organisms or the soil and the water. We're all part of this overarching, complex, interdependent system that has many parts. So that's what he's trying to get us to see. He's trying to get us to see that we're all in this together, right? We're all connected in deep, important, influential ways. So when a change occurs in one part of the pyramid, as I've said time and time again already, that's going to affect the other parts of the pyramid. A disruption in the plankton population will produce a disruption in other marine life, which will produce a disruption in land animals. A disruption in the soil will produce a disruption in plants, so on and so forth. Now, up until this point, a lot of organisms have, survived and done a fairly good job of adapting to these disruptions. But without a doubt, we humans have been responsible for killing off a lot of species. And I think in the U.S. specifically, because of the expansion of civilization and technological advancement and economic practices, something like over 30% of all the species in the U.S. are going to become endangered soon, if they're not already endangered. Leopold thinks this is a problem. Okay, this is not good. Not only because, look, we should care about the animals, because they can suffer, and we don't want to produce unnecessary suffering, but also because we don't want to fucking kill ourselves. Okay? So he's like, we got to care about this stuff. We got to change our economic policy. We got to change our education so that people recognize that, they're a part of this interdependent, complex system, and that currently we're not doing a very good job of protecting that thing. We have, since the introduction of humanity on Earth, instituted a great many number of changes in the biotic pyramid. Through agriculture, especially, hunting and overhunting, and now in our production processes generally, right? And how we handle waste. That's another big one. Pesticides and herbicides flowing into rivers, destructions of natural habitat to produce consumer goods, even the way that we raise animals for meat production is having some sort of environmental impact, right? If you want to get funny about it, we can talk about cow farts or whatever. So, for thousands of years, we have been influencing the biotic pyramid that we're a part of. We've had a much greater impact on it than any other species, any other individual species. And another thing that we need to be concerned with is invasive species. This is another thing that we have accidentally introduced to a bunch of different ecosystems, right? What's the big one around here? The spotted lanternfly, right? Kill this invader on sight, right? You see those posters all around school. Yeah, due to our transportation, due to our expansion, our globalization, we have transported a bunch of species into places that they're not supposed to be biologically, which has upset these habitats. And that's not good. I'm from Minnesota, and what they talk about in Minnesota a lot is mussels, zebra mussels, not bringing them into lakes and rivers that they're not supposed to be a part of because they upset the environment. The big one today that I've already mentioned that environmentalists bring up again and again are our agricultural and industrial practices that release smoke in the air, that produce waste which takes many years to degrade and break down, that produces pollution in the oceans and rivers. All of this stuff is endangering the land. Remember in Leopold's conception, that's like the collection of the elements of the biotic pyramid. But we could say more specifically, this stuff is harming the animals, it's harming the plants, and it's harming us, even if we don't realize it. Thus, I think you would say, what we're currently doing is not sustainable, right? Regardless of the fact that our Earth only has a finite number of resources, he probably didn't think it was cool that we're using them for dumb things and we're destroying our own ability to, well, take care of ourselves in the long run. And so in this book, basically what he tries to do is wake people up to the realities of these practices, to get people to see their relationship to nature in a new light, to propose a new ethic for us to follow in this world in which we have a great deal of power and our actions are starting to have larger and larger effects on the environment in which we live. He says that we need to learn to love and respect the land, at least insofar as it's something that we critically depend on, if not for itself. Right? He even says that we should admire it, insofar as, well, without it, we would all die. It is allowed for our existence and our continued existence. He thinks that due to the way that we've set up human societies, we've kind of alienated ourselves from nature and from the land. During the time he was writing this, he didn't think that humans were spending enough time in nature. So he argues that we need to reconnect people to the land. We need to reconnect them to nature. Technology and cities and all of this stuff have made our lives largely artificial and surrounded by artificial things. While this has given us a great deal of power and mastery over our environment, he doesn't think it's healthy. And this is something that you may hear a lot of environmentalists say, that the kind of lives that we are living are not psychologically good for us, and they're not physically good for us insofar as we're harming the environment on which we depend. So we need to get rid of this idea that we are either a slave to nature or its master. Rather, we should see ourselves as being a part of it, as, being somewhat equal with respect to it. An important and necessary piece of this larger puzzle. Not the puzzle maker, not the slave who is forced to, I don't know, build the puzzle. I don't know. Not a good analogy. You know what I mean. We are, biologically, chemically speaking, a participant in this large interconnected system. We didn't create it, but we do have the ability to destroy it. And that's something that should be on our minds. Something that we need to hold in front of ourselves as our society continues to develop, as we continue down this civilizational path that we are on. And so he offers a few different strategies for getting people to think of themselves in this light, getting us to change our relationship to the land. A big one is going to be education. We need increased education on how we are connected to the environment and all of these organisms. Better education, he would say, too. Because currently we're not really impressing upon students the nature of their relationship to the land or getting them to understand how important this is, not only presently, but also into the future. Part of this is going to involve injecting our environmental education with like a healthy dose of the respect and admiration that he talked about before. Part of the reasons why we're destroying the environment and harming ourselves is because we just see it as a tool. We don't see it as a living, breathing system in its own right that we are a part of. We just see it as an object or as a means to our own ends. Right? And he thinks that that's bad. It's causing us to do all of these bad environmental things. The big thing that is motivating these practices that are destroying the environment is this economic conception of the land. Again, thinking of nature as a tool or as an object, viewing everything in human life through the lens of productivity. Oh, are you being productive? Oh, is that going to, increase the GDP? Is that going to make it so that we're making more money? He's like, you can't view life in this way. And viewing nature in this way not only is destroying it, but it's going to come around and bite us in the ass. Because again, if we destroy this stuff, if we pollute the lakes and the rivers, cut down all the trees, the animals die, we're going to be screwed. I guess then the only thing that we could do is hope to colonize another planet. Maybe you think the situation is so dire that we shouldn't even worry about environmental policy. We should put all our eggs in the basket of space exploration because we've already fucked it. I don't know. It's something worth thinking about though, right? So that's basically what he has to say. He thinks that we have not been treating the land appropriately, partly because we don't understand our relationship to the land, how deeply connected we are to it. And throughout his life, he tried to change that. He tried to raise awareness of how our different practices are harming the environment, how that will retroactively harm us. And he tried to put forth a new environmental ethics for us to follow. So, what do you all think of Leopold's view? You think it's interesting? You think it's, exaggerated? Is there some good stuff here? What do you all think?
It makes sense.
Will you say more, Brian?
I mean, if we screw it up, we screw it up. There's certain things we can't fix, and that could have some pretty severe consequences.
I mean, honestly, compared to all the other theories and philosophers we've learned about, it wasn't extreme. I'm sure somebody could argue that it was, but I didn't see anything that was over the top or like, I don't know, just not targeting one group or the other about a certain topic. Like, it's inevitably everyone's responsibility or burden.
There's no stark contrast with this one.
Yeah, it's like we're here. We've been here since the beginning of time, pretty much, for our time.
A long time, right?
Yeah.
At least according to the human lifespan. Yeah. So, is it that controversial? I don't know.
I don't think it's controversial at all. I think everyone's kind of on the same page. If we fuck it up and kill all the trees, we can't really breathe anymore, and that would be a problem.
Yeah, that would not be good, right? A lot of people think like the Wall-E scenario is coming down the pipe, where Earth is just a giant trash heap and everything's dead. Maybe that's a little alarmist. I don't know. But yeah, he thinks, look, we got to change things. If it doesn't convince you that it's your responsibility, just remember that it's still your problem. Like, it's affecting you. And it's going to affect other people, right? If you don't want to respect the land, you could justify changing how you treat the environment by realizing that maybe you have some sort of obligation to future generations to not screw them over completely. I don't know. But then an important question arises. How much can we as consumers really do? What do y'all think? Certainly there are things that we could change in our life, right, that are more environmentally friendly.
I don't think it's taking it to any extreme. Like, you carpool every now and then. Even if it's not like saving the environment, you're still saving money.
Don't take 2-hour showers.
Yeah.
Like.
A good all of us are broke college students. Gas is expensive.
Yeah. And you rely on your vehicles to make it to class, right? It's not like you can or should perhaps ditch it in weather like this, right? Your vehicle. What were you going to say, Sean?
I guess the only way it would be extreme or controversial is whenever it starts affecting people that actually take advantage of it, like people that do in the oil and gas industry and the business industry, like really going for that. Like if we did use less gas, like by carpooling, or if we bought less, I guess brand names or new items, like just doing secondhand, it could help save it.
Clothes, furniture, plastics, whatever. Plastic is in everything. Like.
Go back to glass, but.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of those big companies. It's their problem, like oil companies that work with a lot of chemicals.
Right.
Nuclear stuff, everyone keeps a pretty close eye on, so that's a lot less of an issue than we'd like to think it is. But it's a lot of those oil companies, the chemicals they use, the waste. What are they doing to dispose of it? Like, there's a lot of rules and sanctions on it in the U.S.
Yeah.
But like overseas, there's barely any rules or sanctions depending on where you are.
Yeah, and not gonna lie to you, I mean, things fall through the cracks. If you're interested in how irresponsible waste practices impact people, just check out the documentary "The Devil We Know," which is about the waste practices of a DuPont industrial factory in a small town and the impacts that has had on the community living there. We're talking about cancer, birth defects, etc. And that's just one small example, right? Killing off marine life is going to have even more disastrous effects and widespread effects. Yeah?
I agree with it all, but I think the question you have to ask is like, under how our economic system works, like under the profit model, you're never going to be able to accurately like protect the environment. Like it's not going to be, unless it's in somebody's best interest. It goes the same with like healthcare and stuff like that. Like it's an inherent contradiction.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So like it would be good if like we change things, but like the incentive isn't there to actually.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's going to take 100+ years to fix culturally what we have right now. Because we're too individualistic to the point where we can't like come together as a group.
Yeah. I mean that's yeah. A lot of people are trying to change that, right? But it's hard to change people's minds when the effects of our actions are so, we don't see them and we're so insulated from them. Like, I mean, you don't see the kind of effect your action is having by just like, buying a mug on Amazon, right? You don't experience firsthand the oil and the gas that was used in the production of the good or the transportation of it or any of that stuff. So it's hard when it's not front and center, it doesn't have a big psychological impact on you, right?
I think also too, like you have to look at it as like 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions in the entire world. And like you could say like that's us buying, but like at the same time these companies own 100 different products and give us the illusion of choice that we don't really have. So like we have to attack this from like a bigger, not individual, but as a group, and especially those companies.
So maybe like getting our Congress people to change like legal policy.
Yeah, I would say that.
That kind of stuff.
Those dudes are all bought. Same guys that are doing it.
That's another thing, yeah. How much corruption and collusion is there, Yeah, it's we can change things in our own lives. But for example, the vast majority of emissions or pollution that we might be concerned about are caused by these larger corporate practices, right? And it's like, well, I individually can't do anything about that. I guess we could, not buy stuff, not buy crap we don't need. But it's like the meat eating argument that we talked about in our animal ethics day. What kind of impact are you going to have on the meat industry by going vegetarian? You're not going to have any impact. But maybe you don't care about the impact so much as you care about the principle. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't want to screw with people's freedoms, but like, how many company executives and celebrities have like a private jet or a yacht, and they produce so much bad emissions and carbon and oil?
Sure, yeah.
Like, I think it was a statistic that Hollywood produces triple the amount of carbon emissions than anywhere else in America.
That's interesting. And then when you see like people who call themselves environmental activists, right, flying around in their private jets from conference to conference, you're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like,
no, I mean,
it's kind of funny, but also a little tragic.
I'm not saying we should all be eco-terrorists and destroy nuclear submarines because they're messing with the whales, but maybe we should be a little conscious of what we're doing.
That's interesting. I had a friend who considered becoming an eco-terrorist once. He's like, yeah, I'm actually talking with some people about blowing up a facility. I was like, what?
Excuse me?
Yeah, that they thought was having a negative impact on the environment.
I heard it was either earlier this year or maybe at some point last year, a Finnish university offered Greta Thunberg a theology doctorate. Did you hear about that?
No. Theology.
Yeah,
Not
doctorate
taking
of
any
theology.
classes.
That's interesting. Maybe a theology of the land. I don't know. I don't know what Greta Thunberg knows.
with like the eco-terrorist thing, if you know that a government is bought and there's no way for them to accurately supply for the people, I think that would be morally right to be an eco-terrorist.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. Does anybody else agree? Does that make sense?
To a point. Yeah. To a makes sense. When I mean, like, whenever you look at like every big change we've had in all of history, it's never come through sitting with in a picket line or putting up a sign somewhere and protesting. It's always come through violence. Every change comes through violence because the state doesn't respond to us just yelling.
Violence is the ultimate human force.
That's interesting. Maybe y'all should reflect on that. If you're willing to get violent about this, and if that would be a good thing. Yes, yeah.
I just wanted to say that like a lot of the major changes in world history have come through peace. Like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., there's so many examples of people being peaceful and getting better results than a violent protest.
Okay.
It just seems delinquents being violent.
Okay, so you're saying, like, look, we don't need to go down the route of extreme violence. Or maybe just violence generally.
Yeah.
There might be some options available to us where we could affect some change, maybe without killing people.
Violence isn't cool, but like there are times and places where it's necessary. I don't know if like the minor parts of the environment justify a level of violence.
Or if what we're doing now, what corporations are doing is...
Mm-hmm. I don't know if that would even be able to change that.
Okay. Yeah.
What he said over there about the peaceful stuff, I think is a great example of American propaganda at work, because MLK was not a peaceful guy. He was inherently a leftist who wanted to overthrow the state. And he's been propagandized over the years to be this peaceful figure. The only way the Civil Rights Act got passed is after MLK was assassinated, there was riots for 3 days straight, everywhere across the country. And same thing with Gandhi. When he tried his peaceful protest, many were killed by the British. They were killed, and it took a violent oppression against those people to set them free. All these people, it's always come through violence. It's always come through violence. It's the reason we don't learn about Malcolm X in school, because he was very violent.
We do learn about
You don't dive into Malcolm X quite as much as MLK.
Yeah, I mean, we could start talking about the educational differences in our institutions. But I hear what you're saying. We might even connect that to how the environment is discussed nowadays. Do y'all feel like there's a lot of propaganda that is pushed on the consumer to make it their responsibility to do something?
I mean, you could use Smokey the Bear as propaganda.
You think so? Well, I guess it depends on how we define propaganda.
You could.
Right?
Does it mean it's negative propaganda? I don't know.
That's another thing, yeah.
This isn't much about environment, but it does show propaganda at work. When the Ukraine war first came out and all started happening, 90% of tweets about the Ukraine war were found to be bots. 80% of those tweets by the bots were pro-Ukraine. And it makes you think, who's doing that?
These systems of communication do open up new opportunities to do things like that, right? We might also say that they give us power, though, right? And if we could act in a concerted way together, I don't know where we're heading, what the future is going to be like, but I do think there's something valuable in Leopold's work. It might be good for us to reflect on, what exactly is our relationship, not only to those around us, but also, the plants and animals, things like that. as we hear of these private and public groups wanting to engage in, space exploration and that kind of stuff. Well, you might ask, is there really much we can do environmentally?
Is space exploration worth the pollution?
Is it worth the pollution?
What?
Perhaps if we could colonize another planet or something and ensure the survival of the human species. I don't know. But that is kind of looking at it through a utilitarian lens, right? There are certainly philosophers. I don't know if we might look at one of them at the end of this class, who think that, honestly, humans should just let themselves die out.
Sounds like a really eco-terrorist view.
But that's something that we can talk about when we get to it. Does anybody have any final questions, comments, concerns, clarifications y'all want to ask about? You feel like you generally understand what he's getting at? It's not nearly as complex as Kant, right?
Dude, take care of the environment. Don't screw it up.
Right. He's saying, take care of the environment, don't screw it up. Pretty much.
This isn't that hard, guys.
All right. Okay, I'll let you all go then. Thank you for coming.
Did you want an attendance sheet today, or?
No, it's okay. I will see you all on Tuesday and Thursday, right? There are no holidays next.